Next, let's take a look at some of the wall controllers that you may find in your system. We introduced earlier the Volume 8, which is an 8-channel volume controller, the Select 8, which is an 8-channel source selector, and the Volume Select 8, a combination of the two. You may also have any number of RED-1s connected to your network, but not more than 24 of them for each Audia or Nexia device, and a maximum of 128 per subnet, regardless of how many systems there are among those devices. The RED-1 has all the functionality of the Volume Select 8, and then some. It generates logic signals, can recall presets, and more. The big difference between the RED-1 and the others is the way that it connects. It is an Ethernet device, while the Volume Select family runs on the remote control bus, which we'll go over later in this section. Regardless, to troubleshoot and make adjustments to the programming of these units, you're going to need the same basic information. Looking at the control dialog windows for each, side by side, you can see that you need to know the object code or instance ID of the block you want to affect, and the control ID or the channel number on the block that you want to affect. In this lesson, we'll only look closely at the RED-1. If you can learn your way around it, the others will be no problem to figure out. These offer two main types of control: level control and logic control in tandem or discretely. They are powered by PoE, so keep that in mind if you're in a situation, for example, where you need to change out switches in the AV closet, rewire a switch, or otherwise have an issue with one powering up. The RED-1 also supports DHCP, which can come in handy, but remember that Audia and Nexia do not support DHCP. From the factory, however, a RED-1 ships with a static IP address within the same subnet as an Audia and Nexia's default address. That address is 192.168.1.201. This means that a single RED-1's network settings will allow it to communicate with a single Audia or Nexia set to their own default address right out of the box. If you receive a new RED-1 or have a spare you'd like to add to your system as a replacement or additional unit, and your existing Audia or Nexia control network is different from the factory default IP scheme, you'll need to change the IP address before it can be seen on that network. You can do this directly on the RED-1 itself by getting into its configuration menu. Now, momentarily shorting the two pins labeled locksmith on the rear of a RED-1 will get you into that configuration menu. Along with changing the network settings, this is where you would go to change display properties like the brightness and screen timeout. See the serial number, firmware version, and other device info. You can also set the device ID this way and add or change a security lockout code. Details about these items can be found on the support site here, or by typing RED-1 on support.biamp.com. Please read the page linked here, as information from it may appear in the quiz. Let's discuss the device ID here, as it's a common cause of trouble in the field. Fortunately, it's a very easy fix. Just what is the device ID? Device ID, as it pertains to the RED-1, is a little different than the device ID that we learned about earlier, which basically tells you which physical Audia or Nexia a DSP block is assigned to. In this case, it's the identifier that allows the Audia or Nexia and the RED-1 to communicate on a firmware level. Of course, you first have to get their IP settings correct so that they can communicate with each other on the network you have set up. Once you do, the device ID is the next and final layer to ensure that communication. A device ID mismatch is the most common cause of the waiting for configuration message you may see on your RED-1. To avoid a mismatch, the device ID of the RED-1 must match the device ID you tell the Audia or Nexia to look for exactly. That means it's case sensitive and won't tolerate any extra spaces or anything like that. Here we have a RED-1 with a device ID of RED space 01 and an Audia programmed to look for a device ID of RED underscore 01. If you tried loading this program, we would see the RED-1 get stuck on waiting for configuration. Once we match up the device IDs, we can send the configuration and we'll get good communication, evidenced by the RED-1 displaying what we programmed it to show. You can set the device ID of the physical RED-1 in two ways. The configuration menu on the device itself by shorting those locksmith pins we just looked at. An even easier way is to set it via the software in the device maintenance window. This second way presupposes that you already have the network settings configured correctly so that the software can reach the RED-1. So go to Device Maintenance and select Remote Ethernet Devices. Find the appropriate RED-1 in the list and select Set Device ID. Enter the new device ID and click OK. The next step, setting the device ID in the software, is also simple but essential so the Audia or Nexia knows what device it's supposed to talk to. Select the RED-1 block in the software. Enter the device ID in the Properties window under DSP Attributes. You'll then see the name reflected in the RED-1's control dialog. This relationship between the software and the RED-1 is so definitive that if you wanted to have multiple identical RED-1s in the same room, you would only need to configure one block and set the physical RED-1s themselves to the same device ID. They would each pick up the configuration from that single block. In this example, the RED-1 block has a device ID of 01. If you were to set each of the physical RED-1s properly connected to the network to device ID 01, they would all receive the configuration. So if you're in a space with multiple RED-1s that are identical to each other, for example, one in the front of the room and one in the back of the room, this is probably how they're being managed in the software. Note that if you have to factory reset your RED-1, it will end up with the default device ID of capital RED-1, capital ID space 01.